I'm Jemma Desai. I work for the British Council in the film department, and we're here to talk about cities because they are a hot topic for any arts organisation for various reasons, partly because of the amount of people that now live in cities, but there's a constant, it feels like a very new to me, but it's actually a constant and historical discussion about how dystopian the city really is for culture as well. So, how do these two things coexist? Are they actually for the greater good, or do they actually damage the way that we work together as social beings? So we've got like a great panel here, who I will allow to introduce themselves as autonomous beings. I'll start with Shola.
I've got to stop sitting right next to the person who introduces. I always first have the introduction.
You're always I can start at this end if you need
No. I always forget. I forget from the thing. Hi, I'm Shola. I'm a filmmaker, and I recently made my first feature film called The Moving Image, which is a multimedia film about gentrification in Brixton that incorporates fiction, documentary, animation, performance art, and photography. And I recently directed a short film called Dear Mr. Shakespeare, which was made with the British Council and was written by visual artist Phoebe Boswell.
My name's Cian Smyth. My CV is quite schizophrenic. I don't know how to explain it, but I generally, in two parts, I have a background in the film industry up until about 2008, and I continue to program film festivals, so keep my toe in the water of film. But since 2008, I've kind of ended up more in just the wider art playbook, from film right across the theatre, opera, visual arts, the whole gamut, and generally through sort of major sort of national or sort of cultural commissioning programs or events or festivals like City of Culture. So it's a bit of a broad pitch, but anyway.
It's relevant.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Archibald. I'm a lecturer in film and television studies locally at the University of Glasgow. And I think I'm here in part because I was kind of involved in organising the Radical Film Network 2016 conference, which took place in this city earlier this year.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about Radical Film Network and why you started it?
Well, the Radical Film, can everyone hear me if I don't lean into the mic? The Radical Film Network was set up in 2013 and is a kind of loose network of academics, activists, filmmakers, film festival organisers, cultural workers and so on. And they had the first conference in 2015. And at that conference, which was set up as a kind of academic conference with people presented 20-minute papers, and it was kind of academic-led, and the activists and filmmakers felt excluded from that because of that format. So I kind of volunteered Glasgow because I thought Glasgow would be a good city to have a Radical Film Network event, because for a number of reasons, Glasgow is a city with a proud radical tradition. When I saw the City of Culture thing, one of the things that always strikes me about this city, when Glasgow was the City of Culture in 1990, the city was covered in posters which said Glasgow 1990 City of Defiance, pay no poll tax. So Glasgow was the kind of centre of opposition to the poll tax at the same time as it was attempting to rebrand itself as a city of cultural production, which is interesting. Anyway, so I thought Glasgow had this kind of history of kind of radicalness. Also, Glasgow has an extremely grassroots, political, radical film culture, which takes place sometimes in here, sometimes in part in the GFT, but often outside of the GFT in places like the CCA or in rank and file places across the city. And also in the post-2014 Indie Ref, what we call the Indie Ref independence referendum. Then there was a heightened degree of political activity, and I could just sense that there was more what one might describe as cultural activism taking place in Scotland than there had been previously. So what we wanted to do was to bring those things together, but to do it in a different way. So we instead of having a conference which was dominated by academics, we had an unconference, which is an attempt to subvert that traditional model and to try and have everything much more in the mix, a much more non-hierarchical event. And then we decided that we would have a festival that would run alongside the conference or the unconference to bring in or to establish links. And we thought that that would be quite a small event. There are some people here who were involved in the initial conversations from Glasgow Short Film Festival, Scottish Mental Health Film Festival, and so on. There may be others, sorry. But that totally grew legs. And by the end of it, there was 30 or 40 different organisations involved in that. And crucially for me, at the heart of it was the Scottish Trade Union Congress, and we transformed the headquarters of the Scottish Trade Union Congress into a pop-up cinema over a weekend. So we did something quite interesting politically in terms of bringing a whole number of disparate organisations together in an attempt to develop an alternative type of cinema. Arguably, you could talk about a third cinema in a different way, a third cinema in terms of its political exhibition. So, I mean, that was the background. That was what we did over that event. It was exhausting. It was exhaustive. We did get some money, I should say, from Film Hub Scotland, who gave us £10,000, and Creative Scotland, who gave us £5,000. So we had a tiny amount of money to pay some people, but it was in the main ran by a volunteer army. But I think it was a very successful event in bringing people together who would otherwise not have been in touch. When we finished, we decided that we would need a bit of a rest, but we've got plans to do something else in the future.
Well, that introduction is goes to the heart of so many of the things that are relevant to this conversation. I think the reason, I think in the last 2 years, personally, my feeling is that the city has become this really this site of so many contradictions, which is not a new conversation. But we mentioned the India referendum, the EU referendum, also highlighted these huge divides between young and old, based on geography as well, rural and urban areas, north and south. This idea of autonomy and power. And the conversation in many ways in terms of cities has become almost overwhelmingly negative. That cities like London especially, I mean, almost you have to take London out of the equation in a way. It's like this responsible for a huge talent drain. It's responsible for a kind of difficulty in living conditions that is not conducive to creativity. And there's all of these conversations going on. And I wanted to start by having that conversation about the different types of cities. We have, 3 different experiences up here of different types of cities that we could talk about. And what we mean, can we talk about cities, or do we have to think about London, first cities, second cities? What is a conversation here? I wondered if we could talk about that first.
I think it's really important to recognise there's more than one type of city, and I think part of it is a capitalist agenda that, and when you're planning the development of a city, there seems to be this overriding model that it's not that someone had a conversation, this is what should happen, but it's like London is the model, model, London, New York, Sydney, they're the model, that's how cities grow, and that every developing city needs to go in that direction, which is total bollocks. And so that's one thing. So I think actually what it has to do is I think we need to start psychoanalyzing our cities, and actually, because I think a lot of it has to do with confidence, self-confidence, and valuing your own place rather than pretending that you need to be like another place, and understanding your own cultural, architectural, and so on, social assets that you have in that city, and developing your city to those needs rather than some other sort of Emerald City type notion that may or may not exist somewhere. But the second thing is as well that there's always this idea that cities are about centres, and they're not. And in my case, like Hull and Belfast too, they're not cities that are about centres. I mean, Belfast certainly is developing more of a centre city lifestyle now than it used to, but for different reasons. Both those cities don't really have a city centre sort of ecology. They do obviously have city centres, but it's not where the whole social life of the city revolves around. And of course, I mean, city centres are important because they are generally spaces where you get all different parts of the city ecology to gather together when it needs to happen, because civic pride is important, this idea that you all own your city. in whatever way you want to, you feel safe and be able to be creative in, is an important thing to try and encourage. It's not simple, obviously, but it's generally a principle that should be attempted. But in Belfast, for example, obviously it was under curfew for so many decades, right up until quite recently, really. So the idea that people lived in the city centre and developed a culture there was just, of course, little underground things happened and that. But so that these have sort of consequences. So, for example, in film terms, like in Belfast, in the QFT is based in the south of the city. It's a lot. It's much more difficult than you'd think, getting someone from the north of the city or the west or the east to change their behaviours to go to the south. Not because they don't want to or whatever. It's just the ecology of living in that city has pushed people just live in their part of the city. So the idea of building audiences is much more complex than when you go to a conference like this or a conference somewhere else and they're talking about developing audiences for film. It doesn't apply, when I was on the Olympics and different things like that, going to London, and they'd all say, oh, we're going to do this, and everybody, is very excited about something, and I have to put my hand up and go, no, I'm sorry. And there is often this thing that we're just belligerent types who just are always complaining, and we're not. We're saying our places don't work like that. So, you could go on forever about that, but that's just a couple of thoughts around that idea of having confidence in your own city and a vision for it, and that idea that cities don't all operate the same way.
Yeah.
Hull city centre, obviously wasn't under curfew for 40 years or something like that, but it's actually, I think, has a lot more to do with how they planned the development of their city. Obviously, post-World War II, it was quite heavily bombed, so the way they sort of rebuilt the city and where it sort of ended up, the people ended up travelling through their city, they're all on the outer fringes of the centre too, for very different reasons. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a different way of having to operate with the population of your city.
Shola, I want to bring you in because there's an idea of cities within cities as well. So this idea that you explore in A Moving Image, which is about a certain community within London that's resisting some of the changes. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of, there being a resistant community within a city that's changing so quickly?
Yeah, I think it's, again, to riff off, I think what you were saying, it's like this confidence thing. Because my personal issue with London or parts of South London, like Brixton or Elephant or Peckham, is that these places have always been culturally vibrant places with like huge cultural capital, huge diversity, really interesting kind of like left field spaces. And for me, it still seems like a weird thing when we're talking about regeneration that where a lot of the time the language is like prior to this regeneration, this space was kind of like not really fulfilling its potential. All of the vibrancy, all of the culture, all of that isn't like qualified as potential. And what we're seeing is like a kind of homogenized sheen that's spreading out, so everything kind of looks the same. The same kind of stores on the high streets and stuff like that. And the resistance to that is that people who have been living in these spaces, who have built culture in these spaces, spaces that historically people might have not wanted to go to because they were scared or because they felt that it was a bit rough, they don't have a vested stake in this new development because of pricing, because the regeneration isn't having them in mind. It's very much about redesigning, upscaling, which again, in terms of language, why is that upscaling, bringing in a whole new kind of, I guess, class of people? Why is that an upscale to this environment that has produced so much cultural capital, that has so much diverse energy, and the resistance is against that. It's about losing culture to kind of homogenization, and not feeling that you have a stake in your own community. And that's replicated in South London, that's replicated and what the film tries to show is replicated in New York, it's replicated in Berlin, it's replicated in various spaces. But it looks also at race and how that intersects with it as well.
We're going to come on to a City of Culture Hull in just a second, but I think this is a good way to talk to you, David, a little bit about some of the things that you discussed when you introduced Radical Film Network. this idea of activism, this idea of change and resistance, community mobilisation of networks. Why did you feel that this network of activists had to be mobilised at that point? Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the changes in a society and the need for a wokeness, I guess?
I don't know if it was so much about mobilise. It was about bringing people together who are already doing things, and recognising that people doing things but bringing together can create something which is bigger than the sum of its parts. And that rather than people being involved in seeing, I mean, if you're in this city in September and October, you cannot move but for alternative film festivals. So there's a Human Rights Film Festival, there's a Scottish Mental Health Film Festival, there's Take One Action, which is another activist film festival. And there are many, there's SQUIF, the Scottish Queer International Film Festival. There are many, many others. And I think there may be, and I should say there's also something been set up recently called the Social Action Filmmakers. Oh, Richard.
Social Action Film Exhibitors Network.
Right, it's called SAFE, but they're rebranded. Unsafe, yeah. So there's loads of stuff happening, but it was a bit, rather than seeing all the people involved in this, rather than seeing them each other as competitors, but to attempt to build these things and see them together. Now, why should we do that in the moment? I mentioned that I thought there had been an upturn since 2014. I mean, now we're living in a different moment, a really dangerous moment, in my opinion, politically. And of course, cinema's deeply political. I mean, I was teaching, I did a class on political cinema recently. We asked the students to read the editorial from Cahiers de Cinema in 1969, which is written in the immediate aftermath of 1968. And also to read Adorno on the culture industry. So they get to read all this leftist film theory. And then at the same time show them Dirty Harry. And if you want to look at Trump, you can absolutely draw a line through American cinema and white supremacist narratives in cinema, which go back from the Western and John Wayne, through films like Dirty Harry, and then take us through things like The Apprentice and the celebration of the entrepreneurial individual who's a badass motherfucker who sorts everything out because he understands business. So these narratives that have been created in that instance in television, but also in cinema, are important, and the right, whether they're organised or not, absolutely understand the power of popular culture. So I'm interested, although the Radical Film Network is not political with a large P, it's socially engaged in the funding applications. And it's interested in developing, it's absolutely implacably opposed to the total racist movement that has developed, that has been uncorked, that was perhaps nascent or perhaps there and has been uncorked, and is about attempting to do something entirely different, because absolutely, I don't think in my lifetime there has been a more dangerous time politically. And cinema creates stories and narratives which absolutely influence how people understand the world. And it's about making like a tiny contribution where you are. What can you do? You can do what you can where you are. Now, London, I lived in London for a year when I was young, and I found it like a terrifyingly massive city. One of the things I like about Glasgow is that Glasgow, for most people, is a really quite manageable city geographically. There's a lot of talk about how Glasgow's cultural production is. I mean, Glasgow's a magnificent city to live in terms of cultural production and the success of a whole number of different things. So what they call the Glasgow Miracle, which is challenged but sort of exists as a thing in terms of all the artists who've won the Turner and stuff like that. So it's critiqued, but nevertheless, Glasgow's a very interesting place in terms of cultural production. I think in part that's because something to do with the scale of the city. That for most people, I don't know if it's bigger or maybe comparable with Hull. So it's got a feel that it is a city, that it's a thing. And I always felt that London was just too big for that. So something like how would the Radical Film Network work if it was in London? I don't think it could work on a kind of London-wide basis. But I think that there's something about the size of this place which has allowed it to develop that. That doesn't mean that we allow everything to be in the city centre. What we attempted very deliberately to do was to not take radical stuff to the people, but to find networks and individuals who were already doing things somewhere and to develop links there. So we had a number of events that took place in Govan. Which is a part of the city which was formerly the kind of industrial powerhouse of the British Empire, or part of that, and now doesn't have its problems to seek. But it's not about taking things to people, but about working with people who are already doing things there, and thinking about how we can work with them and introduce cinema in a different way. So it's about bringing things together, rather than creating new things, I think.
I think the idea of narratives is relevant to, the idea of being conscious about the narratives that we are all creating with our work at this kind of politically uncertain time is very much of relevance when we're talking about City of Culture. It's very much of relevance when British Council are talking about cultural relations and the value of culture and doing that work. Because that narrative is often about transformation. We're going to come in and we're going to do this, intrinsically positive work, and we're going to transform a space. And I think this might be a good moment to potentially talk a little bit more about City of Culture in Hull. Maybe show your clip?
Okay.
Yeah?
You're either interested in life and what it means to be human, or you're not. And the arts is the way that we do it, I think. It moves us, it thrills us.
Not everybody kind of understands or learns about the world in a single way. I think that's what the arts do. I think they kind of give you another vehicle to then either understand yourself or understand the world or understand your neighbour. And it brings you closer to what sometimes can feel so far away from you.
For me, it's kind of like, it releases this everything what's in here, and it just goes, then it's out of me and it's out there.
I think arts is most powerful when it isn't art, and when it doesn't feel like art, and when it isn't anything associated with the word art, because the word art has so much baggage with the people that feel that they're not capable of art. So I think the actual moment of art is when you are magically moved.
We all have this inherent creativity and art within us. So I think when people say art is not for them, I like to challenge that, and I like to find a way to really expose that, because fundamentally we're all artists.
Everybody has creativity, and it's just a question of finding what the channel for that is.
All you've got is your authenticity. You've got your viewpoint, you've got your experiences you lived. You hope that there's some sort of fragment in the way that you viewed the world. That's what we're all trying to do, is just capture this small moment of how we viewed the world at that point in time, and hopefully there's something in it that someone either finds completely absurd and challenging to their own humanity, or something that someone relates to which they can then relay into their own experiences.
We shouldn't try to provide the answer to everything, and I think in some ways actually allowing people to define art for themselves, allowing people to take a bit of curatorial control, and just giving permission for amazing things to happen.
Great art can connect you to the place that you're in. It can make you transform the way you view the world, and can bring you, I think, essentially would bring you closer to what I can only describe as humanity, a deeper understanding of humanity in all its complexity.
It's never perfect. And I think sometimes you can get lost in that quest for perfection.
art is better out than in. If it remains in, we don't speak to each other, so it's being expressed and understood. It's another form of conversation.
I think cities are like people. If you are neglected or overlooked, underestimated, and yet you know that you have this incredible history, you've got all these talents, you need to find some way of breaking through people's perceptions and making something happen where people reassess.
Art has the power to help us to tackle some of the very basic problems. We know that there's a lot of social inequality, lots of isolation.
I used to find it really difficult to talk about Tourette's without tears. Biscuit. And then I had a conversation with Biscuit, my friend Matthew, who describes Biscuit, my tics, as a crazy language generating machine, and told me that not doing something creative with them was wasteful. Biscuit, and this idea took root.
Maybe it's that hunger, I guess. Maybe it's that thing that you just can't seem to turn off.
And it's a risk. You're taking a risk, you know, you're taking a risk. Okay, I think this is going to work.
The thrill in the unknown, and I don't know what to do. I'm in this kind of no man's land of fear.
There's no right or wrong way to do it, anybody can do it.
It's having that reason to be alive.
Art has that ability to make somebody think differently about their world.
Every shared laugh or conversation or piece of artwork has the potential to create change.
As the world evolves, as politics evolves, as relationships evolve, as climates change, as everything in this world is all orbiting around or fluctuating, there's never going to be this moment of stillness. Its impact on people and its impact on the city is something to be analysed and understood. If this isn't arts and culture, what is?
It's about us not telling the community what, well, this is art. It's the other way around. They tell us what art is. And art for them means many, many, many different things. Culture means many, many different things.
If anyone hasn't seen Jess Tom's show about her life with Tourette's, you should go and see it. I think it's called Adventures in Biscuitland or something like that. It's really, really, really good. Her Tourette's is the word biscuit, one of her. So she keeps on saying biscuit and she hits herself like this. But she is really, really brilliant. You should go and see the show.
Well, the film is really fascinating because it, brings together so many things that we've started talking about already, and it brings to mind, what the question that I have for you is, you bring together quite a lot of questions about, how art can help, how culture can help, and also some of the issues at stake in approach. So, could you talk to us a little bit about how, particularly Whole City of Culture is taking a certain approach to think about equality, because there seems to be a big thread here in that film about access for all communities to this transformation.
These are all very complex issues. I mean, you could go quite dry with it and explain what a sort of a business model or a philosophy, something like a City of Culture is, because you could go anywhere from it's really a branding, marketing exercise to gather a common conversation around the value of culture and arts to our society in an increasingly noisy landscape whereby everybody's fighting for attention in terms of government interest or even... and then you could go another way and say the essential... purpose of something like a City of Culture is partly to do with offering an opportunity for civic pride. like in Belfast terms, things like that, there's an awful lot of different conversations come into it, because the idea of people from different sides of the community sharing public space is really important, because they're all quite geographically divided still, even if they're not necessarily throwing bricks at each other. So I think, Shola McCarthy, who's in that film, she was also the director of Derry, a city of culture. And I think, I suppose the message I try and get across is it is that idea of giving your citizens permission. And I think it's a number of permissions. One is permission to be creative. One is permission to have access to the best work out there in the world. One of it is permission to go into spaces that you don't normally have access to by opening up buildings or doing work in spaces that have been neglected. It's about permission to be a citizen in your own city, permission to own your city, permission to have free speech, to say what you want in safety. It's a lot of those things, and I suppose the city of culture at its best, obviously everything, it's a risk-taking venture, so even if it was a model that always worked, the nature of creativity is about investing in risky ideas, and some of it will work and some of it won't. But it's an opportunity just to move in and one level sort of offer offer at least the arts sector in that city an opportunity to achieve their full ambition for a period of time, but hopefully with a legacy that allows them to build long term. And yes, I suppose involve the citizens of the city at large in a common cause that is just about them and their place. There's so many avenues you could go down in this conversation. It's probably better in a Q&A. I don't know.
So in terms of the film itself that we just saw, you have loads of involvement of artists that are working in Hull. You have what was your approach to making that film? What did you want to do with it? Who did you want to reach with that particular communication of the value of the project?
Well, I suppose part of it was trying to capture why the arts are important. It isn't even so much that the arts will bring us together, which can be a bit of a meaningless phrase. I don't think it's meaningless in terms of public space, because it does. That's a literal thing that it does. But I think if it's speaking to anybody, it's trying to speak to the non-arts enthusiast. Well, they're not an enthusiast if they're not interested in the arts, but to just the average punter out there who may not have engaged or even understand why it's worth doing something like a city of culture, and just explain to them what art is, because it's a very hard thing to define sometimes in the abstract. So it's actually given it a social purpose as well, and explain why it's important.
And this anxiety that I think all of us that work in the arts and want to work with audiences have of, being in a sort of semi-privileged position to having the power of what to decide to show, who to work with, who to give access to those spaces to, is kind of at the heart of your work, isn't it, Shola? Could you tell us a little bit about the story behind the work, and then we'll show you a trailer?
So a moving image follows a woman of colour called Nina, who was born and raised in Brixton, but she left to go to a more affluent area. So upon her return to Brixton, she finds that she's labelled as a symbol of gentrification, which she kind of is in considerable angst, because she's a Brixtonian, she's born and raised in Brixton, but because she left and she's come back and she kind of has all the paraphernalia of a hipster, she realizes that she is now being painted more as a part of the problem. And so she goes on and she creates this visual art project, which is about exploring her complicity. Like, is she part of the problem, or can she create a piece of art that can maybe be used as a resource and be something that's good for the community? So her kind of psychosis as a character in the film really was reflecting my psychosis making the film, considering the perceivable role of artists in the process of gentrification. There are some spaces, for example in LA, there's a group called Defend Boyle Heights, and they are way more active, and I wouldn't say aggressive, but way more active in shutting down symbols of gentrification. So they will go and they will shut down a gallery in their area, or because what they will see is I've heard statements where they've perceived that their art, like they're Chicano Latino, so their art isn't being perceived as art in these spaces that's already existing. But these galleries come in with their kind of, their sense of what art is, and they're calling it in their own way a new form of colonialism. So, not to be as extreme, depending on what your viewpoint is, in a London context, we know that artists move into spaces, and that can be the first phase of gentrification in a way. And so there's an inherent complicity being an artist trying to make a film about gentrification, and I couldn't really avoid that. So the film really does become a film about the purpose of art, and is it actually something? Of course, it is something that's good, but how can you be responsible using it without cleansing communities in one way or another?
Yeah. I want to open it up to the audience in a minute, but just on the basis of that and kind of some of the things that you were saying, David, earlier about, Glasgow being a smaller city, but London being this expansive city. And I think it's very interesting that those two clips weren't London, New York, they were Harlem, Brixton. So they were cities within a city, they were communities that had made their own smaller spaces within an expansive space. So I thought that was quite interesting. But there was also a kind of dialogue between, are we inward or are we outward? Who are we talking to? So you as a filmmaker chose to not just talk to your local community in South London, but you chose to look at the parallels internationally. There's like this narrative post-referendum that we need to be outward-looking, not be inward-looking. But in order to protect our communities, there is a sense that we must protect them and resist change. And I wondered if you had some thoughts about this idea of, it's a UK city of culture. It could be an international city of culture.
We discreetly dropped the UK when it was in Derry, not in Hull.
Okay.
In Derry, kind of UK sort of slipped off the brand.
Yeah. But this whole narrative of inward and outward, authentic and kind of changing, is that something that we could discuss just quickly before we open up to the audience?
Well, one other point then, there's loads of points, but one other point then is about, if you think about what Scottish cinema is, then you might get the impression that Scottish cinema is totally white, predominantly white, with occasional interventions by filmmakers who, so Loach, comes here and makes A Fond Kiss 10 years or so ago. But if you look at grassroots documentary filmmaking on the ground, then you get an entirely different sense of what filmmaking is in Scotland. And in part, that's because people have been coming here people have always been coming here. The idea that multiculturalism is some type of new thing is just bullshit. It's like we live in a place where, I've just made a little film about Govan, which was the kind of one of the centres of what was called the Kingdom of Strathclyde, and there was a kind of whole Scandinavian movement here, and the people stayed, and so there's always been people coming and going in these islands. But in the last few decades, a number of people have come and have stayed. And recently also, in part, some of the issues to do with the art school, artists have come and stayed and from different places in the world. So now if you look at cultural production at a grassroots level, it's entirely different. So, just to give 2 or 3 examples. So there's a filmmaker, in fact, she's just moved away. She just moved to live in Portugal, but she was here for a few years. But Carla Novi was a Glasgow-based filmmaker who was from Mexico, studied at the art school, made a film about Bangladeshi factory workers and the students in Mexico that disappeared. Now, that was filmmaking in Scotland. The very famous Spanish filmmaker, Thea Boyain, who's a total star in Spain, lived in Edinburgh recently for a few years, still does, and made a documentary about what it's like for the Spanish, the kind of mostly middle-class workers from Spain who can't get a job there because of what they call the crisis, comes here and makes a documentary about that. So the other thing about the Radical Film Network, or the other thing about how we understand the cities in which we live in through cinema, is there's absolutely crucial that we have a much greater exhibition of an alternative type of cinema than the one that we just, the dominant narratives that we get on this on screen. And I mean, this came up yesterday in relation to discussed about the archive as well. You know, films about the archive are all white people, you know. And the cities that we live in now are much more complicated than that. So, you know, so I'm interested. So how we understand the city through the cinema is exhibitions crucial, but actually creating a space. There's loads of discussion in Scotland about how there's a crisis in filmmaking in Scotland, and most of the discussion is around production. Which then there is a crisis in production, but there's a crisis in exhibition as well, in the sense that things get made at the grassroots level and there's not enough opportunities to see them because the multiplex absolutely dominates what people see in this city. So creating alternative spaces for exhibition isn't just about, you know, for creating spaces for radical, socially engaged cinema. It's about allowing the city to speak to itself in a way that the dominant city, the dominant cinema denies.
So this inward and outward is constantly in dialogue?
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
I don't know. I think a lot of these things are sort of super narrative level stuff that actually everybody should be considering. I think it's just getting an increasingly noisier world, and there's always this drive to simplify very complex messages and narratives. And in a sense, City of Culture as a branding exercise is part of that model of thinking of trying to focus attention. Let's have a conversation about the value of the arts or whatever. But I think it's really important, exactly what David was saying there, that actually we need to start as a society at large, as a nation, as a whatever, as a world, start thinking that, you know, we live in a complex place, and that is a good thing, and that is therein lies issues like diversity and stop making these very dry things that are spoken about in parliaments and assemblies. But this is actually lived experience. They're not KPIs. You know, it's okay not to live in metropolitan spaces. You know, I just think there needs to be a whole sort of cultural, philosophical shift about what it means to exist in a nation or a city or a place. Like one of the things I do outside of Hull as well is I run a queer arts festival in Belfast, and you know, like Shola's films there, the issue of gentrification is extremely important there. Like a lot of the artists we know or friends we have in New York, for example, which, you know, in the 70s, 80s was like a thriving place, a lot of sort of queer countercultural work. It was like, it's a mecca in a sort of landscape memory for all of us who didn't get to live that experience. But some of them who are still there, who are still alive after the AIDS crisis and things like that, they're left on an island in Manhattan, in downtown, that is totally been neutralized in a way. You know, the atmosphere has been totally vacuumed out of the place. And they're still working away, they're plugging away, and they're still in basements where they can get them. But every other week there's a bookstore that closed down, or there's this. So I suppose the question, I think, and one of the tasks for something like a City of Culture is actually saying, it's all okay. You have your coffee shop on that street. We would like to put a dancer in it someday if 5 people go and see it. In festivals, from film festivals all the way through, I started up a documentary strand in the Belfast Film Festival, and you know, there was a time when I was younger where it's like a mark of shame that only one person went to see this film. Now I am really excited, because what's important is how much that film or that experience impacts on that person. It doesn't matter whether it's a full house. You know, and that's like a really, in basic sort of arts production terms, my whole thinking around all that stuff has just entirely shifted. You know, it's to move away from the models that you're taught, or the models of working that were all put in, the whole strategic planning processes and all that. They're all valuable exercises, but they have to stop being treated as Bibles. You know, for people to operate within the landscape that they're in, you know, and respond in a live way to things. Now, one of the most amazing things I've seen recently, I was in Sao Paulo last year with some work with the British Council, and they took us, we literally got off a 14-hour flight, and they took us straight to this place which is called the Theatre School of Sao Paulo. And it's genuinely one of the most amazing places I've ever been. And they basically went in there and squatted in a building about 10 plus years ago. And that place was overrun by pimps and drug dealers. And there's a huge transsexual sex worker issue in Brazil. And actually, these are really, really important things. Like about 4 trans sex workers a day are murdered in Brazil. And this theatre with no money just decided, went in, they opened up a little theatre in a basement, and then they opened up a bar next door, and they built relationships with the drug dealers and the sex workers, and then eventually over a period of time they started giving the sex workers jobs in their box office and reception and in the theatre, and the bar staff for all of the, now they have a whole theatre school, a whole building, 2 theatres, restaurants and cafes have moved in around the area. Now this is where the complexity of gentrification comes into it, because the idea of developing your space into a place, into a better place, whatever that means, is an important pursuit. You should be allowed to do that, but gentrification, as it's explained in Shola's films there, is a complex thing. It's not that only people who are wealthy get to move in and change a place to where they want to live. That whole sort of gumbo, as the word is used, is really important to retain that. But that SPS Scuola de Teatro place in Sao Paulo, everybody should go. If they forget to go there, it's fantastic what they do.
We should all go to Brazil.
Yeah.
Shola, do you want to add anything in response to what you've heard in relation to the experience that you've had when you've travelled around?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's very much just the echoes. Like it's super complex, and I felt the complexity of the subject when trying to make the film, which is eventually why I think I decided against just making a purely fictional narrative of the film. I just couldn't really access it. It became really clear really quickly that it would require real people, and some of the key moments in the production of the film was Reclaim Brixton, which was a big anti-gentrification protest in Brixton, with about 5,000 people came to Brixton to protest. And I mean, it kind of has a semi-ironic kind of sense, because some people would say a lot of the people who came to protest gentrification were gentrifiers. But it was, that was like, to me it made sense that kind of the first real big kind of protest kind of kicked off in a space like Brixton. And I'd been going to meetings building up to the protest, and there was all kinds of interesting things happening behind the scenes, kind of people, how people were perceiving the protest. Some people seeing it more as a community day, more of a kind of, almost like a giant street party, others wanting it to be more radical. And of course it then ended up with the Foxton's window being smashed, and police pepper spraying individuals. And that shaped, I mean, that was one of the first things we actually shot, it was actually some of the first things we shot with documentary, and that really then shaped the narrative in a way, and I was working in that way where the documentary and the fictional parts were informing each other, to create something that wasn't so binary, but was fluid and had space for everyone's kind of views, and to try and leave the audience with questions and not resolutions about how to solve gentrification, because it's impossible. And when I was traveling, when I was in LA and meeting some people and hearing about Echo Park and Boyle Heights and seeing the similarities between all of these different spaces and the different ways in which different resistance groups are approaching it. Like, and even in a place like I was talking to you about Melbourne, I was there because of a moving image, and I was in a place called Footscray, which is really one of the main kind of like immigrant communities in Australia, where it's predominantly East African, kind of like Sudanese, Eritreans, and East Asians like Vietnamese, and they're dealing with Foxtons. No, Lend-Lease. They're dealing with Lend-Lease,
which is their Foxtons.
Which is the same Lend-Lease, who were the same company that gentrified Elephant and Castle. So they are dealing with just the international reach of some organisations. So
like Westfield.
Yeah, in that way. So to be in a place like Footscray and seeing them kind of like up against Lend-Lease in the same way that the people in the Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle were complaining and protesting. And then seeing people in like Echo Park or Defend Boyle Heights, how the radical, some would say, means they will actively shut down a gallery because they see it as a threat to their existence. And I think that's super interesting. And we're not quite doing that in the same way in London. And there's questions about whether you need to do that. But it's an interesting thing to see how globally we're all dealing with gentrification in different ways and the nuances of that.
Yeah, and it goes back to your point about, the first point being that we need to be quite skillful at communicating the value of it before we start any of these initiatives, so that the site of the art gallery doesn't become the site of resistance, that there's a different conversation that's going on, I guess.
I think even just in audience development terms, the art sector, the artist, the curator sometimes is part of the problem. It's not like they're always the solution. Like we've all been in many an art gallery where it feels like, oh, you're not allowed to come in here unless you are a certain type of gallery visitor. So, so there's so many different ways of shifts, but it's not just, I think these are all universal things. I think it's about how we're sort of somehow directed to live our lives and work these days. It's actually right, let's throw all that in the waste paper basket and start from scratch and just be a human being.
I want to open it out to the audience, so if you raise your hands, I think there's a roving mic. There's one up here.
Hi there, Nigel Humberstone from Sensoria Festival in Sheffield. As a director of the festival and as a musician myself that's worked in the city of Sheffield for nearly 4 decades, we see a lot musicians and creatives being forced out of the city by developments. Do you think, I'd like to know from you if it's what can be done. Do we try and change the mindset of city planners? So it keeps cutting out. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Do we try and change the mindset of city planners, or do we adapt as people, as creatives are very good at doing, adapt to the evolution of cities?
I think both are true. Personally, I see there's part of the whole thing, there are tipping points in these things because it's innately conservative and traditional thinking to be anti-change. But at the same time, there are things that are traditional that are worth protecting. But it really is about who has the power of choice. So I think the question is constantly engaging on a political level with your city council about, I want to be part of this decision-making process. It's not your choice, it's my choice, or it's our choice, about what the next steps are. And if I'm getting a bit too sort of abstract with that, like in Belfast just there, yes, they've just knocked down a load of buildings in the Cathedral Court area, which is where a lot of artists and arts organisations are based. And they're buildings that probably, in architectural terms, probably not that important, but they've got character. And obviously what's going to go in its place is some sort of glass block, and it's not going to be architecturally interesting or whatever. And so, the whole arts community there are up in arms about, that. And obviously there's a whole process of hotels moving into that area. It's become the tourism offer, all that sort of stuff. And yes, we're always banging on Facebook about how horrible it is, and we're trying to stop certain things and keep it the way it is. And similar things happen in Hull around issues like that. But so there's part of me that says, yes, there's a protectionism there, but protectionism is a very dangerous thing to play with. And then there's part of me that thinks, yes, move somewhere else. There are plenty of areas that need artists to move into and be creative in. And it's part of the social change. It's inherently creative to be part of that change. So I'm big into the idea of change personally. So there's part of me that goes, give over and move on. If you're going to be a progressive, be progressive. But I suppose from my point of view, I leave it to other people to fight the battles if they want to keep something the same, whether it's worth protecting or not. And I advocate or support where I feel I need to on an individual basis. But so I don't think it doesn't really answer the question, because there's two choices there, I think, to make.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, of course, please.
As part of Document Film Festival recently, we screened Peter Watkins' 5-hour, 45-minute version of La Commune, Paris, 1871. And I mean, what's interesting there in terms of cities and space is that after the Paris Commune, they absolutely redesigned the city to prevent protest. You know, so it's not. So cities are strategically designed by the powers that be, often to organise the population as they see fit. Now, increasingly, it's now organised around consumption. So that in Glasgow, there's kind of some discussion about how they're going to take the steps away from Buchanan Galleries, at the top of Buchanan Street, in order that they can create more shopping facilities so that people can consume more stuff. So it's not just people who are opposed. You'd often think it's the people who are opposed to things that often think about public space. But public space is always thought about from the other side. I suppose my thing is, I was thinking about what you do in terms of moving around the world, doing different things. My philosophy in life is like, I do what I can where I am. So it's pretty much local. So that's what I would do. It's like, what can you do where you are? And if you think that, so in Glasgow, there's not a big problem about gentrification and people being moved out of places that I'm aware of. There's not enough people to gentrify things, I don't think. So while there's a kind of process of places being gentrified, there's not, as far as I'm aware, artists are not being forced out. In fact, artists are coming here. So yeah, come to Glasgow.
I think that might be the solution.
That's a really good one.
How are we doing for time? Okay. Unless there's a burning question, I think we're going to wrap it up there. The message is move to Glasgow. There's plenty of room. Thank you very much to the panellists.